I'd like to welcome you to Lecture 7, which is on the second part of Chapter 6 on human bone growth. So when we look at the human skeleton, it's an amazing thing, the way it grows. And when we look at particularly the fetal skeleton, we're going to see today that our skeleton starts out more like two types of connective tissue. One's going to be a hyaline cartilage base, and one's going to be more of a traditional connective tissue origin. And we're going to see that how each bone itself develops as a separate organ, and some bones even develop from previous bones. And much of what we think are one bone could be made up of several parts. So it's amazing when we look at how the body arranges itself. Now, this is another view of looking at particularly the human forelimb, and we can see in the child's mesenchyme tissue, this is a primitive baby tissue. It's really not differentiated into much of anything else. And we can then see here, okay, the starting material for at least the long bones, and there's a less distinct tissue for the what we look at it as the short bones and some of the irregular bones. So this is amazing when we look at fetal development and how in the early stages we're just a massive connective type cells, non-differentiated connective tissue cells, and in some areas these cells just know to form these bone pegs that develop the rest of the body. And you can see here the correlation between here, your humerus there, and then there's your radius and your ulnar. And these little pegs eventually divide and divide and divide to become your fingers. And what's really neat, this is under control of these genes called Hox genes. And what the Hox genes do, they start out with one body part that we sometimes find in our primitive ancestors. Is just one little digit there, and that replicates to become several. So it's really kind of neat that what's called bone primordium can divide and divide uniformly. And in some cases, we get errors in these little spots, what we call Hox gene errors, in which some of these don't develop, or you're sometimes missing fingers based on little mutations, or sometimes this bone, which actually starts out as a single peg unit, might not develop into two. So it's just an amazing plan to watch the body form. So when we start talking about bone development, we're going to be using the term osteogenesis or ossification. And usually we save the term osteogenesis for the development of primordial bone, and sometimes for extreme healing process. Ossification we sometimes reserve for mature tissues that are filled in with hydroxyapatite, the calcium component of our bone. So what we're going to do is look first at fetal bone development, because later on in this lecture we're going to look at the development of bone tissue during damage. So when we look at fetal bone development, before the second month of development, the baby is not much more than internal organs that are just developing, and this mass of tissue we call mesenchyme, which is still trying to figure out what to do with that mesoderm material. Is it going to be bone? Is it going to be muscle? What's it going to develop into, and how's it going to form the blood vessels? Because the heart is early in development, but there's technically no blood vessels yet, and the heart is really a single pump, not the heart that we see in the adult, you'll get on later on in this course. We then have what's called postnatal development in the bone, and this is when we look at early childhood, and we're going to see this type of bone specifically is going to be mostly elongation of the long bones and appositional growth of the flat bones and irregular bones. And then as we get older, our bone growth is limited to remodeling and repair, unless you have a condition called acromegaly or giantism, in which the bones can sometimes continue through adulthood, which unfortunately you don't get total bone growth through adulthood. What happens is eventually the long bones fuse, and the irregular and flat bones and some of the short bones keep growing and growing and growing to make this person that reaches a certain very tall height, but the height stops growing after around between 18 and 24, and then the bones just thicken to the point where the skull could even start crushing on them, and the weight of the thickening skeleton is too much for the muscles and for the heart to even handle the weight of that. Now, Also, when we look at ossification, we're going to have two major types of ossification, depending on what type of bone tissue you're forming and what type of bones you're forming. So we're going to have what's called intramembranous ossification. And this is primarily found, I mentioned this earlier, in like a hypodermis type area. And these stem cells, infiltrate the area and then start forming osteoclasts that again usually develop flat bone and parts of the irregular bones. So we can see here, and look at this, the clavicle, a lot of people confuse for a long bone, but actually it is a flat bone. And you see typical developmental defects associated with this depending on sometimes the position of the fetus. So this one, in some resources you'll see it's a long bone, and I've argued for years because of its embryology that it's a flat bone. So again, this is typical of that type of tissue, and this is where you find a lot of subtle birth aberrations that have to do with the young body as it's growing and interacting with the environment. And then there's what's called the endochondral ossification. And this is where first a cartilage peg is laid down. This is not a mushy connective tissue like here, a mesenchymal connective tissue. This is more of a dense connective tissue, cartilage, usually hyaline cartilage that forms first, and then the chondrocytes kind of step aside and they get infiltrated by osteoblasts, which then impregnate that hyaline cartilage with skeletal muscle. So let's first take a little more detailed look about intramembranous bone growth. What you can see here, and you should all recognize this is an areolar type connective tissue, except this is going to be devoid of fat cells. But you're going to find here, there's your fibrocytes, you got your collagen fibers, reticular fibers, elastin fibers, all in here. And what happens is some type of signal, probably from these fibrocytes, due to some genetic programming in the body, obviously, and also due to position of this tissue in the body, sends out chemicals that attract these osteoblasts. So these osteoblasts probably migrate in from other bone centers, that are there, or they might even develop here from existing stem cells. There's a lot of debate about that. But anyway, these either migrate in or mature. And then their job is to start filling in a particular area of that they're going to lay down either the irregular bone or the flat bone. And how that is done is incredible. It's mostly done through signaling, okay, and also done through where this tissue is in relationship to the body. So what happens is once they start forming an initial bone, okay, and what you're seeing here is they first lay down a little collagen and then they lay down the bone as they go along. And you can see already that these guys are building and some of the other ones are becoming surrounded in their own little lacunae and now they're trapped. And they end up going from osteoblast to osteocyte once they're trapped. So their main job is to just stay alive and maintain their bone tissue so it doesn't die. And in some cases it doesn't occur. In some cases in babies, these actually turn into tumors. And can create problems, sometimes benign tumors, sometimes cancerous tumors. And chemical exposure to certain carcinogens could probably help to induce that. So now you're getting your bone tissue forming. And then what happens is the bone gets sculptured. So you first develop this laminate type compact bone that eventually, particularly in flat bones, gets turned into the interior of that flat bone. So in the flat bones and some of the irregular bones, the interior gets formed first, okay, and then it starts turning it into spongy bone. And then ultimately what you get is on top of that spongy bone, you get a little collar here, and these guys are now depositing a very heavy layer of laminate bone. And what this does is give strength to this bone. So this gives compression, this gives strength, and this gives a little flexibility, where this gives rigidity. So with flat and irregular bones, the inside forms first, and then later a collar forms around the bone. You can see this is almost true also with endochondral. And now we're going to look at endochondral ossification, which is, again, similar principle, but a little different than the intramembranous, in which instead of being in this loose connective tissue, we're now going to look at how bone formation occurs in this pre-existing cartilage, and particularly hyaline cartilage. And what's important to know is that this is the body plan that's laid down in what we call these bone pegs. And eventually these bone pegs become ossification centers. It's funny because in some animals, this hyaline cartilage remains, and that becomes the skeleton in itself. So this is showing an overview of the stages. So when we look at a fetus, what a fetus has is these little bone pegs, hyaline cartilage, kind of literally positioned in the body based on, of course, these things called Hox genes that tells this mesenchyme tissue to form this there. And again, this signaling is done by cell communication, by what's called gradients. That means the relationship of that body part to the brain and then to the central axis of the body. And so we see here is this hyaline cartilage. And don't worry about that cap right now. But what happens to this hyaline cartilage? What first happens is you get this, what's called this collar ossification. And basically what this does, this is the beginning of the osteoblast starting to form the outer surface of this bone. And why do they do that there? Because this is where the periosteum is, which actually starts off as perichondrium in the young bones, but the periosteum has those osteoblasts there. So they just start doing their job. And what they do is help eventually to support the bone. So what they're kind of doing, you're going to see, is they go from here and stretch that collar of the bone all the way out. And that helps to give this young bone some brace, not so much for support, but for the what's called the primary ossification. So what happens first is you get this bone collar, small bone collar that's going to be moving in this direction and this direction as this cartilage now starts to grow and expand. And then in the second step now, you get what's called the primary ossification center. And that means now I'm going to start building the beef of the bone. And notice that the diaphysis starts first. We're going to see the epiphyses start a little later as like a second bone that then gets attached to this. So the diaphysis forms first. So what happens, just like in endochondral, we're going to form this like a hyaline mass, dissolve away the hyaline cartilage, okay, and then replace it with bone and sculpture that bone to be spongy bone. So as this bone is growing, notice the bone is growing out because there are chondrocytes that are here that keep producing new chondrocytes, forming that bone, so the bone's growing out. And notice how the shaft of the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, also is growing. So what's happening here is when you look at this bone, the layers you'll be seeing are going to be the osteon type bone here. And as the osteon bone is being formed, more of it is being formed kind of in an outward direction to make that bone wider. And then this is being turned to spongy bone, and sometimes the spongy bone decays to turn to medulla. And you can see right here, the medullary cavity is starting to show nicely like in the adult bone, to the point where you're now getting a spongy layer, a thicker osteon layer, and now you're going to start getting more of a laminate layer covering that up to form the collar. Now notice here too, right as the bone reaches a certain site, then we get what's called secondary ossification centers. And these develop the epiphyses bones as separate bones in themselves. And this is very neat because eventually what's going to happen is you see this little cartilage here in young children. This is going to be flexible. It allows a better cushion. It allows for reaction of their body to growth, so it becomes adjustable. But ultimately, about 18 to 22, this thing fuses solid, and it prevents further bone growth. So as long as this cartilage is still there, this cartilage can produce new cells and push the epiphyses up, meaning making that bone longer. And as that bone gets longer, of course, the diaphysis fills in and the medullary cavity fills in. So this is what's called endochondral bone growth. Chondro meaning cartilage and endo meaning within. So again, this continues to about we stop growing. And once you stop growing, basically all that happens is bone maintenance. So again, to look through these steps, you can see this is about week 9 in utero. That means in the uterus. So you get this bone collar, this primary ossification center is just now solid. Hyaline collar is being turned to solid bone. Now the bone is going from osseous type bone to right there would be your osteon bone, I should say, and then you're turning it into spongy bone, and eventually the spongy bone disappears, and you start getting your medullary cavity. And I want you to notice as this blood vessel grows in, for bone growth to occur, the primary and secondary ossification centers actually attract the blood vessels. So it's not that the blood vessels know to go there, they are teased to go there. And ultimately this happens for a nerve too. Chemicals that attract nerves grow into there too. And unfortunately, in some cases, people are born where the signal to produce a blood vessel, which is called angiogenesis, I should say, produce and attract a blood vessel, doesn't happen. And children are born with missing bones. And you can and there's been some famous people, and sometimes athletes that have been born with missing fibulas or missing clavicles or missing finger bones, whatever, that makes this a little more prominent, but this is not unusual to happen. At birth, this is the bone at birth now, so we're starting to see the epiphyses are starting to form, but there's still a very large growth area that allows for a lot of growth. The bones are very delicate at this point. You don't want to put a lot of pressure on the child because that could damage this area. You don't also want the body to be distorted or in one position all the time because that can also affect the final shaping of the bones. And what's really sad is a disease called rickets, which is a lack of vitamin D, because vitamin D is very essential for bone growth and development and for calcium uptake. So this could cause the bones to bend because during this period of time, the weight of the child is pushing on these soft developing bones, and you could end up with a curvature, or in sometimes actually the epiphyses end up at an angle because they're so flexible. And this leads to a pseudo curvature of the bone. The person is shorter, and the attachment points are at an angle to the bone, to the articulating bones, and that can create a problem. It can create physical handicaps. So here's the adolescent bone, and this is where forensic scientists can find a skeleton and tell the age of the skeleton approximately, unless the person has hormonal problems, by these epiphyses. And usually before puberty, bone growth is similar for males and females, and then it starts varying after puberty. So it's very difficult before puberty for a forensic scientist or physician to tell the gender of the skeleton. So again, to reiterate the picture, there we are. That's the steps of endochondral bone growth. And just understand, how it starts off, this general sequence, and what is a primary and secondary growth center, and what's the importance of the epiphyses, particularly in children. This is very important. Now with postnatal bone growth, okay, you're getting a lot of interstitial growth, which means this is by the epiphyses expanding out, up and down, pushing the epiphyses away from the shaft and extending that shaft. And then they also have appositional growth, which means the bone is thickening, widening, adding new osteons and pushing that collar out and making new collar and thicker collar as we go along. But this is under control of a couple of hormones, the major one being growth hormone, but other ones being thyroxine, which is in charge of the metabolic rate of these cells, and also estrogen and testosterone, or basic androgens, which are the precursors to estrogen and testosterone. So what happens in many cases, if, let's say, hormone levels that encourage bone growth exceed the age where they're supposed to turn off, that means eventually the epiphyses form, you end up with interstitial growth stops occurring, but appositional does. And this can create problems for the skeleton. And there are defects of bone growth. We see people that have, like what's a person called the elephant man, has had problems with controlling appositional bone growth, in some cases interstitial bone growth. So how do bones get longer? We've mentioned, how do we grow? Again, it has to do with that epiphyseal plate. And this is going to go to it in a little more detail, but you don't need to know, all the details of epiphyseal growth. You just need to know that the bone caps, the epiphyses, are pushed out, and there's this delicate growth center right between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. But basically, the stages that we see of bone growth are going to be what's called proliferation. That means that the cartilage cells that are in there have to produce new cartilage and have to replicate. Just like skin, they replicate and replicate and replicate. Just like to make the layers of skin, you're adding new layers of bone, new bone tissue. This proliferation is highly dependent on not so much calcium at that stage, but mostly protein, fair amount of oxygen because there's cell replication going on, and you need a high metabolic rate, a lot of oxygen. So that means the blood flow has to be good to provide those nutrients, particularly protein, a fair amount of glucose because of the high metabolic rate. And this is a lot of times when children are growing, they need a lot of calories to feed that long bone growth, that proliferation. And then once you get proliferation, you get this hypertrophic growth, which just means that area gets enlarged. The cartilage is growing, it's swelling, you're building new tissue now. And then you get the calcification of that tissue and eventually the ossification, meaning that eventually that tissue turns to adult bone. It fills in where it needs to have the laminate bone, the osteon bone, the spongy bone. This is a close-up of an epiphysis, and you're looking at the proximal end, the distal end, that means the end towards the upper body. This happens to be the humerus, or a rendition of the humerus. It's not a great one. It's kind of like a typical bone. So what we're seeing here is the proliferation stage. That means that this area is producing new cells on top. So these new cells are being born on top. And what happens is that when they develop, they produce another layer, and it keeps growing and kind of pushing that out. So this thing's being pushed out by cells being developed under it. What happens then is they get kind of stagnant in place, and they then become the hypertrophic zone. And look at that, they become bigger. That means they're going from osteoblasts, who are mostly involved in mitosis, to now metabolically active osteocytes. Okay, so they are now getting bigger, and I should say chondrocytes too. So they're getting bigger, okay, and then they calcify temporarily and then build the final bone. So understand that these cells were sitting there originally as this type of cell, and they keep pushing a new layer out, okay, and then they mature through these stages. That means they were once proliferative, then hypertrophic, then calcifiers, and then ossifiers. And again, just understand how this occurs, because this is very subject to nutrition, too much gravity, pushing down on a child, on a person, and even a young adult can slow this down, okay, and cause the bone to become shorter and thicker. So again, we mentioned earlier about hormones. What hormones are responsible for bone growth? And probably the most prominent hormone, which I didn't mention, this is an overall hormone that's involved in the whole body, but it does play a role in bone growth, and particularly with epiphyseal plate activity. That means the long bone growth. And this is why you see in people with acromegaly, they produce a lot of growth hormone, but the long bone growth refuses to behave, and it stays stagnant, mostly in adulthood. Of course, before that, you can grow a person that's 8'1". It's incredible how tall you can make a body, but once it reaches the person's growth stoppage, because if you didn't, you'd end up with a 20-foot long person, tall person, which wouldn't quite survive well. Okay, but now, so what happens is the bone thickens in place. So it thickens because growth hormone is responsible for all growth. But we particularly focus on the height part of it, because this is used to look at growth curves in children to see what the growth hormone activity is and how it's affecting the body. Thyroid hormone, again, affects the whole body, but it controls the growth rate of the cells, the metabolic rate. So it determines how well they use glucose and oxygen and uptake nutrients. And then there's testosterone and estrogens, which basically work almost the same, particularly at puberty. And they actually are always working with bone growth, because these belong to a group of hormones called androgens, which means I'm going to produce a person. So technically they do play a role throughout the lifetime, but they take on a different role during puberty, where they actually in humans cause a change in the skeletal shape. and a change in the rate of growth, particularly the proportion of the legs to the torso and the legs to the arms. So once bone is fully grown, okay, now what happens is your epiphyseal plate, this cartilage here, after a certain point in time starts to mature. What causes this is just a switch, a genetic switch. Because some people, man, they can stop growing at 14. Some grow until they're 24. So this plate, and this plate is also affected by stress. If you put undue pressure on this plate, it can actually turn off the plate at an earlier stage. And malnutrition can slow down this plate too, and even prematurely seal it, so you can end up with a person that's technically smaller, because what the body's doing is trying to conserve growth because of the lack of nutrients. And we see that children that are malnourished tend to be shorter in stature than a brother or sister that wasn't. And we see this sometimes in generations of families that move from a poor country to a wealthy country and they're eating better. Their children tend to come out genetically taller than the parents would have been. I should say should be, because actually the parents were shortened by the malnutrition, so they didn't reach their full height. With bone remodeling, okay, we're going to see that eventually with bone, as it gets mature, chunks of bone are going to be absorbed and rebuilt constantly to respond to pressure and tensions and gravity and other stuff. And you're going to see, particularly during attachment points, where there's attachment point of a tendon or a ligament, okay, or a muscle putting pressure somewhere, or another bone putting pressure somewhere in an articulation, you're going to see remodeling occurring dramatically. So in a baby, the bones are smooth like this. In an adult, what you're going to see is that where attachments are, you're going to see that the bone is going to respond to the attachment by actually filling in that attachment. And what's going to happen is this bone's going to be weakened in the cartilage is going to stretch, and then it's going to harden into this bony tissue that fills in that stretch area. So this is going to be really kind of a neat thing. So what happens is that uh, uh, muscles, tendons, and ligaments attach to that periosteum and can stretch it out, and it fills in with bone. And you're going to see this on your bone specimens. This is how you can tell elderly bone, particularly because elderly bone has a lot of tugging on it over the years, a lot of pressure on it, and a lot of muscle pushing against bone, that you see these markings nicely. And people that were manual laborers, you see exaggerations where you end up getting these things sometimes called bone spurs, in which this piece of bone comes out a lot and can actually cause problems when it breaks or punctures nearby tissue. So again, when we look at mature bone, we're going to see that over time, bone gets slightly injured due to use, and also what happens is we continually add strength to the bone, or we change the bone surface to respond to stress and strain. But what for bone deposition to occur, and this is so critical, because this is the problem with young children, are either undernourished, that means not getting enough calories, malnourished, which means they're getting the wrong calories. Like when I was growing up as a kid, mom and dad couldn't afford the high protein foods, so we ate a lot of carbs and very little proteins. And this, I'm sure, affected our growth. But also, we need vitamins, particularly C and D for bone growth, and vitamin A, and of course, calcium, phosphorus, and phosphorus we compete for other purposes with. We need magnesium and something called manganese, and you sometimes see these on vitamins as being essential nutrients, particularly for children. So yes, a bone doesn't just grow. It gives its length and its strength and its ability to heal itself and maintain itself. Because remember, bone is maintained throughout your life. So a depletion of any of these can be a problem. And particularly with calcium and protein in elderly people, is if they don't get it enough, the body will borrow from the bone. And this can lead to a condition called osteomalacia. Malacia means softening, osteo means bone. So it's not the same as osteoporosis. That's more of an estrogen-based disease, not so much nutritional. At one time, they were confused. So with bone resorption, again, bone is a continuously growing tissue. So in the fetal bone and the adult bone, it's not unusual to have these cells called osteoclasts that are basically just always active, always eating bone. Again, osteoclasts are related to immune system cells. Okay, and they have lots and lots of these things called lysosomes, organelles that contain digestive enzymes, which we find in many cells, but particularly, in your intestinal cells, in your stomach cells. But what happens is the osteoclasts produce enzymes that digest the collagen matrix. They digest all the fibers, and then acids dissolve the calcium and the phosphate out in the magnesium and manganese. And what happens is all this content either gets used as food for the osteoclast, or it gets sent out of their cells and into the interstitial fluids. It means the fluids around that bone, and eventually into the blood. And but particularly the calcium, those salts are recycled. And guys, under malnutrition, the job of the osteoclast is that it literally eats the bone on purpose to provide the blood with amino acids and with the salts that you need for muscle function and nerve cell function. So what controls bone remodeling? We're going to see the hormonal mechanisms that actually control calcium homeostasis. So once bone is formed in an adult, we don't really need so much of the growth hormone and the thyroxine as much to maintain them. I mean, we do need small amounts, but not a lot. So what we really do, and this is kind of like an energy-saving step, and it simplifies the body, is we let the need for calcium determine the bone remodeling. Now, this sounds kind of weird and it's kind of risky, and it does lead to problems, like I just mentioned earlier, is that if calcium gets low in your body, particularly, it will actually take that calcium from bone, because bone is a storage area. And what happens to that calcium is, guys, your nervous system and your muscular system need calcium in huge amounts. And sometimes this calcium is just temporary usage. So what happens, it's more important for the body to take calcium out of the skeleton and weaken it than not having your nervous system and your muscle function. So this is important that we use hormones that actually control calcium to do this. And sometimes bone remodeling is under the control, again, of gravity and body stress, mechanical stress. And this can throw off sometimes the calcium balance, because bone's under stress, you're now using calcium that could be used in other places. So again, we talked about this. Why is calcium essential, not just in bone, but it's essential for nerve pulse, muscle contraction, blood coagulation, secretions of certain glands, okay, and of course cell division. So again, the bone is just one user of calcium. Now, so what controls calcium levels in the body that helps bone remodeling in the adult? This is not in the fetus, this is in the adult. And what could be some problems? There's a couple of hormones you have to know. One is called parathyroid hormone, and this is found in what's called a parathyroid gland. If I was to draw kind of like that's your head and that's your neck, it's a very skinny head. We got an alien here. Okay, I'm going to draw the thyroid gland in green, and it looks like a little butterfly, and we're going to see that comes into play, and there's going to be 4 little dots in most people called the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid means that near the thyroid. And the parathyroid gland, let me draw your face so you know it's a head and not some bony knob. There we go. So this is either ET or the alien from Close Encounters. Okay, so this hormone called parathyroid hormone, what it does is it's produced in response to calcium levels in the blood, because it receives a lot of blood. It's an endocrine organ. It receives a lot of blood signals. Okay, so what happens is that with parathyroid hormone, it tends to release parathyroid hormone in response to low blood calcium. So as blood calcium gets low, parathyroid hormone is a stimulant to the osteoclast. So these are already active osteoclasts and now being made more active. And what they do is they go in and degrade bone. So guys, the last thing you ever want to do is have a tumor or an overproduction or some factor that causes overproduction of the parathyroid hormone, because that would just strip the calcium out of your bone and weaken your bones. This also breaks down the protein matrix, and you can have a lot of problems. So as a result of parathyroid hormone, that means normally in response to low blood calcium, that means you're not taking it in your diet, or you're losing it somehow due to some type of disease, or that calcium is being used up somewhere. The parathyroid hormone called PTH encourages osteoclast activity, and the calcium is released in the interstitial fluids and then into the blood, and then eventually enough gets in the blood that it shuts this baby down. And if you want to look at this like the seesaw model, and this doesn't always help me, but whatever. So what happens if blood calcium gets lower? Okay, it stimulates the parathyroid glands. They produce PTH, parathyroid hormone. Osteoclast is stimulated, and what they do is they bring that seesaw back to balance. Now, next we're going to see what happens if the calcium gets too high. So when the calcium gets too high in the blood, that's what that means, too high, another hormone comes in. And this is one of the hormones produced by what's called the thyroid gland, which, funny enough, is right near the parathyroids. That's pretty good placement, but it's probably accidental, because there are people that sometimes have to have their parathyroid glands removed due to tumors on the thyroid gland might crush them. So they move them sometimes to another part of the body, and the parathyroid glands work real well, because they basically just need a blood flow to get the parathyroid hormone into the blood and to receive the signals and what to do to measure the blood calcium. So anyway, to get back to the thyroid, when blood calcium gets high, either due to over activity of the osteoclast or due to diet, what happens is your body's natural tendency is to produce calcitonin from the thyroid, and don't worry about the parafollicular cells. Those then cause the osteoblasts to become active and inhibits the osteoclasts. So the osteoclasts are kind of shut down a little, they're a little slowed down, and the osteoblasts are enhanced. And then what happens is that puts the calcium into the bone, either for bone growth, rigidity, or storage. And then there's this little hormone called leptin. Leptin is what's called a satiation hormone for when you eat fats. It makes you not feel hungry anymore, and it actually gives you a craving and a happiness with eating fats. Woo, that's nice. So leptin, we believe, also may play an influence in bone density. But it may have an opposite effect on bone density. And this is the frightening thing about high fat diets. It might cause disproportionate high levels of leptin, which might inhibit osteoblasts, particularly in childhood obesity. This can create skeletal deformations and defects. So now we've built the bone, let's break one. Wow! And I mean, don't do this as a homework assignment. So when we look at bone fractures, so we're going to break a bone before we learn how a bone is healed. So bone fractures, and guys, I want one warning, and I hate to stop in mid-sentence, but one warning. Bone fractures are given different names by different people. So you're going to hear people use different terms. Let's just go by the ones in your book, and later on you learn these if you work in that type of area. But typically, the way we name bone fractures, how we classify them, is by the position of the bone ends after a fracture. And typically what we're going to do for fractured bones is since this course focuses on long bone, we're going to look at mostly fractures of long bone, because this can get crazy when you start looking at the irregular bones and short bones. If you go into radiology or imaging or physical therapy, you're going to have to deal with this, because it's really important to understand and particularly multiple fracture situations. Like I once x-rayed someone that he was a mechanic, and he didn't have a secondary jack under the car. The primary jack broke, and what happened was the frame of the car when the car came down, it just crushed onto his legs and smashed literally his hip bones, his upper thigh. It was just a mess, and luckily it missed his bladder and all of that. It was just a bone. I mean, it was an incredible fracture that had terms that are not in your book I was running into. So, so when you look at position in a fracture, okay, to the ends of the bone, okay, are they displaced? Or are they non-displaced? I mean, are they intact or not? Okay, and also is the fracture point itself displaced or not? And this could be seen in long bones. It could be seen basically in any bone. What's the completeness, okay, of the break? Is the break totally through the bone or is it incomplete? And there's different degrees of incomplete. Are we halfway through? Okay, or are we just a crack on the surface? And then we look at the orientation. And this is where we focus mostly on long bones and short bones because it's difficult to say orientation in irregular bones, although we can do it. But it's just, I don't want to get into this in the class. So we can have what are called linear, and that means parallel to the axis of the long bone, going up and down. Or is it transverse? That means are we cracking that bone literally into half and half, or chunks going along the width of the bone. And then we can look at the interaction of the muscle and the skin, the tissues. And there's also, you can have bones that penetrate internal organs and serous cavities. And again, this activity we kind of leave out of your book because it gets into really complex terminology and you just need to know the general principles. So if we're breaking material and rupturing material outside of the bone, we start getting into what's called the compound fractures. And this now becomes an urgent problem. And then we have the simple where it's just the bone itself is broken. So now, again, when we describe fractures, we can look at other aspects too, besides the degree of the fracture. We can look at the location, the external appearance, and the nature of the fracture. So let us look at some different types of fractures and just don't know them as an expert, but just say, wow, I've heard these, and I can answer a couple of questions about these. So we can look at a fracture called the comminuted fracture. Okay, and we can see here, look at this, we got some displacement. We got some non-displacement. That's actually subtle. Well, here it is, non-displacement. And we got a little mild displacement. And this bone, we can see this is partial. Let me draw that in green. That's in partial, and that's complete. Okay, so this is, a complex, more of a break. We got compression breaks, and that means that the bone was crushed. And you can see here some of the bone was actually crushed. Okay, and that's really more of an incomplete. But this is very complex too, and that bone tissue is shattered, and the bone maintains integrity, but it just has a problem with articulation and can be painful. We have here a spiral break. That would be a straight break. A spiral break kind of goes along like this. You usually find these in those type of moments that, hey, watch this. Or when a person is walking in heels, very high heels, and they slip and twist the ankle, and that would be here. Perfect when they just snap that tibia in a spiral. And these can be pretty much hard to put pressure on. And look at that. We could also say this is dislocated. Not completely, but partially. There's a total dislocation of the epiphyseal. It's actually partial epiphyseal. Okay, so that is incredible. And in a lot of these, you'd end up with skin being broken and muscle being ripped. Okay, so it's, just look at these, appreciate them. We have a depression here, which is typical of flat bones. The depression can be complete, like in this one. It means the bone was just totally torn out, or it can be more of a compression type, which is still intact. Here's a green stick. These are sometimes called incomplete. And sometimes these don't heal well. So the green stick just means that you get a little fraying in the tissue and the crack is in here, but it's not all the way through. And you find these a lot on young bone, but also you find these on, so more common on children. You do find these on elderly sometimes when the bone is a little deproteinized and also low in calcium. And sometimes these are just due to a hit injury. These tend to have problems with healing because with some of the other fractures, you get internal bleeding in a bone. And blood is necessary, we're going to see, for bone formation and bone healing. So these sometimes don't bleed, and you have to induce bleeding or somehow get blood vessels to there. So let us look at the stages. This I find more important that you understand blood formation. So when a bone is damaged, assuming blood vessels are damaged, or somehow there are nearby osteogenic blood vessels, that means blood vessels that are around the periosteum whose job anyway is to be there and help with bone formation. So if there's blood around, you get the initiation of bone healing. And this first step is called hematoma. It means a blood tumor. And I remember as a kid, I had birth defects in my legs due to a genetic disease. And when I got older, some of this caused abnormal hematoma formation in my legs. And luckily it got caught because this could eventually turn into a bone that would have taken over tendon and ligament, and I would have not been able to walk, okay, on my left leg. So I wouldn't have been able to move it. So it was lucky that I had a very aggressive physician at the time that was able to treat that and other problems associated with my birth defects. So what happens is a hematoma forms. Blood vessels are ruptured. You get an inflammatory response, which you need for any type of healing. So that inflammatory response due to the hematoma is sending dozens of chemicals in to help repair and to help eat up dying tissue and stuff like that. But the important thing is that this hematoma clot forms. So you got the hemorrhage, which is just incredible bleeding that eventually self-heals. It's called a clot. And then the hematoma. And then the hematoma becomes a site of inflammation that blood vessels can start getting attracted to and then start that healing response. So that's a darn bad fracture with a you got a translocated fracture, okay, with separation. Looks like there might not be any other tissue damage there because I don't see any tissue there. It's kind of funny around it, but whatever. And your periosteum's intact, so that's pretty good. If the periosteum gets ripped, sometimes it has to be surgically sewn or stapled together or sometimes super glued together. That's kind of funny. Super glue is now done because it's kind of hypoallergenic and it works well on tendon. Kind of soaks in there. But anyway, we got your hematoma, and that's going to be your primary healing site. So now at this stage, the hematoma is being turned into what's called a fibrocartilage callus. Callus just means disorganized tissue. We find it in a lot of creatures. We find it in tumors. We find it in plants. So the term callus just means an irregular tissue. Don't confuse it with the calluses on your hands and feet. That's kind of also an irregular epithelium produced in response to stress. But anyway, the fibrocartilage forms, and it's a very irregular, dense cartilage. Okay, and what happens is the immune system cells, macrophages, other phagocytic cells, I mean cells that eat stuff, come in, they start clearing away the debris. And what's now going to happen is this other hormones are coming in to help with repair, and this attracts osteoblasts into the area. And what they do is they start producing spongy bone as the fibrocartilage is slowly starting to be eaten away. So they produce a temporary patch of spongy bone. Why? Because it's quick to build, it's flexible, and it's easy to resculpture. And it doesn't take much effort. And it's the easiest thing to put in place. So first you get this peg of spongy bone that's just acting like a temporary support in a shape. And what the body hopes to do is use the spongy bone to shape that. Now here's why you don't want to walk on a fracture. Because as that fracture shifts, the spongy bone keeps resculpturing to adjust to the fracture. And you might end up with a bone that has like a 40-degree angle in it in the healing. It might actually cause that bone to twist and turn and heal based on the last movement that you have. So that's why we want to stay off this bone and be careful about the pressure we put on it. So the osteoblasts come in. Fibroblasts also have to come in because they're going to be putting down, new collagen fibers. This is a little different process than bone formation because the collagen, the hyaline cartilage, is not there. And this is similar to what happens in intramembranous bone growth, like for flat bones. So now we get tissue being repaired, everything's going on, and we get our first little stage where now we have this kind of like hardened hyaline cartilage. Blood vessels are coming in. You're getting spongy bone even around here. You got a spongy bone cap to seal that in place. But again, the spongy bone cap, if you were to take this bone and stand on it and this twist this way, that spongy bone cap will adapt. It will grow out this way, eat up this way, and cause that bone to heal like this at an angle. So we got to be careful about that. And that's why when a bone is broken, physicians do reset it and then immobilize it. So now we get our little callus cap. And next, now the callus cap is filling in with new, harder trabecular bone, spongy bone. Okay, it's called a bony callus, and this is going to be the next step to producing the replacement tissue, which is to be more of your laminate and dense bone. So there we go. Now that is actually true spongy bone. Okay, and notice here, this is disappearing. This gets reabsorbed by osteoclasts. Sometimes a permanent bump, a small bump, remains as evidence that you broke a bone. And this is particularly important when they x-ray children to look. They look for these bulges, particularly, and this becomes a different radio opacity, particularly if it hasn't healed yet in children. Sometimes it can take a couple of years. And, I mean, several years sometimes for the bone itself to totally replace itself if it does. So this shows up in x-ray. And if you see a lot of children, children that have a lot of these little bulges in their bones, you go further, do a softer x-ray to look for that tissue. And then you can tell, if the child is just accident prone or actually being abused. In the last step of bone remodeling, what we're doing is now taking that kind of spongy bone and trying to bring everything back to normal. So, and look, there's still a little bulge there, but now the spongy bone here has been turned into a compact bone that's either going to be osteon or laminate, and that's being carried out by the actually the periosteum. So your periosteum has to be intact. If the periosteum was killed, they have to surgically stretch and add new periosteum. What happens is if there's a medullary cavity here, we fix the medullary cavity, and if there's red marrow in there, yellow marrow, hopefully that will fill in. Sometimes it's lost permanently during bone damage. So here's your stages summarized. You got your hematoma, your fibrocartilage callus, you're forming your bony callus, which is now going to be true spongy bone, and then you do the remodeling to try to get back to the normal adult bone, basically your laminate bone, your osteon bone, your spongy bone, and hopefully your medulla. And then this eventually over time, the remodeling stops or the remodeling can continue slowly. So thanks for being patient with this lecture. And what we'll do is next lecture continue into the articulations. We're going to learn now how the bone organs work with this joint structure together with the muscle.